right, good morning or good afternoon, Lomtastic students. Good to see you again. I am going to be reading another chapter from School Days According to Humphrey by Betty G. Burney. We are on chapter 10. Let's see, we only have 3 more to go. Goes to 14. Do the math, boys and girls. We're on 10. Goes to 14. How many more videos will I be posting? All right, chapter 10, The Very Worst Day. That Monday was an unsqueakably difficult day, more difficult than any day we had last year in room 26. First, Thomas said that he'd seen a wolf while he was walking to school, but Mrs. Brisbane got him to admit it might have just been a big dog. Mrs. Brisbane reminded him not to exaggerate. Worst yet, Phoebe had forgotten her spelling homework and burst into tears, which made her sad, sad, sad. Next, Mrs. Brisbane asked Paul to come up to the board for some math problems, and both Small Paul and Tall Paul jumped out of their seats. When they got up to the board at the same time, they glared at each other. The other students laughed. "Sorry, guys, I meant Paul G," Mrs. Brisbane explained. Tall Paul turned red and Small Paul scowled as he returned to his seat. Small Paul liked to do math problems in front of the class. Tall Paul got the problem wrong and turned an even deeper shade of red. Sounds like they're embarrassed. As if that wasn't bad enough, Kelsey skinned her knee at recess and had to go to the nurse's office. Then Mrs. Brisbane had an excellent idea, as she often does. She decided to put me in my ball and let me roll up and down the aisles. She probably wanted to get her students' minds off their problems. It would be very interesting if all humans could get a hamster-eye view of the world at least once. If they did, they would probably clean their shoes more often. They really are unsqueakably awful things stuck to the bottoms of many shoes. Humans should pay more attention to their socks, too. On that day, both Thomas and Kelsey had on mismatched socks. They've also realized how much they tap their feet and move around in general. Even when they think they're still sitting still, as I spin around the classroom, I'm always glad I have the ball to protect me. Despite the dangers, I kept rolling around lazily. Ooh, that's a good LY golden word, boys and girls, lazily. The students were reading to themselves and after a while didn't even seem to notice me. As I approached Rosie's table, I decided it would be interesting to get a closer look at her wheelchair. I still hadn't figured out exactly how she would pop a wheelie. Rosie saw me coming closer and her eyes sparkled. "Hi, Humphrey," she whispered. But when I got a little closer, Holly let out a yelp and grabbed my hamster ball, picking it up so quickly I was doing somersaults. "Eek!" I squeaked. "What is it, Holly?" the teacher asked. "Humphrey could trip up Rosie's wheelchair. He got way too close," she said, holding up the ball. "But I've got him now." "He wasn't too close," Rosie protested. "I saw him there." "I think it's dangerous," Holly said. "The way you picked him up is dangerous," Rosie replied. "You could have hurt poor little Humphrey." I don't like to think of myself as poor little anything, but she was right. I wasn't hurt, but I was definitely a little dizzy. "You must remember to be gentle with Humphrey," Mrs. Brisbane said as she took the ball from Holly. She peered in through the yellow plastic. "Are you all right?" I squeaked, though it was a weaker squeak than usual. Mrs. Brisbane put me back in the cage, satisfied that I was okay. I headed straight for my sleeping hut, which was the safest, quietest place I knew. I crawled out a little while later when I heard Rolling Rosie ask if she could speak to Mrs. Brisbane. The room was empty because it was lunchtime. "You didn't pop a wheelie again, did you, Rosie?" the teacher asked. "No," Rosie answered. "It's about my assistant." "Holly?" Mrs. Brisbane said. "Why don't you tell me what's on your mind?" Rosie wheeled up close to the desk, and she and Mrs. Brisbane talked. Og and I were as silent as we could be so we could hear what they said. I don't think I need an assistant, she explained. I can do almost everything myself. So could you tell Holly not to help me anymore? Mrs. Brisbane was silent for a moment. I could, she finally said. But do you really want me to? Yes, Rosie answered. I know Holly wants to help, but she helps way too much. She helps me when there's no problem at all. Sometimes she even gets in the way. Have you told her that? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Rolling Rosie nodded. I said she didn't need to help so much. It didn't work. Again, Mrs. Brisbane was silent for a moment. I can see you don't need much help, Rosie, but maybe Holly does. She finally said. Holly? Rosie sounded really, really, really surprised. She likes to help, Mrs. Brisbane explained. I think she'd be pretty upset if I said you didn't need her anymore. Maybe she could help someone else, Rosie suggested. Let's give her one more chance, Rosie, Mrs. Brisbane said. I'll have a word with her to see if things will improve, okay? Good old Mrs. Brisbane. She really knew how to handle students. Now we better eat. I'm going to the lunchroom too, she said. As they headed out of the classroom, I couldn't wait to talk to Og. Were you listening, Og? I asked my neighbor. Hopefully Holly will be upset if she gets fired. I knew that because I'd be squeakably upset if I got fired from my job as classroom hamster. Boing, 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 Og agreed, splashing in his water. I thought the day would never end, but at last the afternoon bell rang. As the students gathered up their backpacks, Mrs. Brisbane took a sheet of orange paper and approached Phoebe. Phoebe, I have an idea to help you remember your homework, she said. Each day, we'll put a big colorful reminder in your backpack so you won't miss it. What do you think? Okay, Phoebe said. I've written your homework assignment on it. All you have to do is remember to bring it back, Mrs. Brisbane continued. Phoebe nodded. I will, she promised. You can do it, Phoebe, I squeaked. Then I hopped on my wheel and started spinning as fast as I could. I think she was smiling when she left the room. The day took a turn for the better. After school, when some of my old friends from last year came back to room 26, there was Raise Your Hand Heidi Hopper and her best friend Stop Giggling Gail Morganson, along with Repeat It Please Richie Rinaldi. I was spinning on my wheel when they came in, and I was so glad to see them. I stopped suddenly and almost tumbled off. Please don't make sudden stops when you're spinning on a wheel. Hi, 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 I squeaked. I'm not sure they could hear me over the loud splashing sounds Og was making. Humphrey, my favorite hamster, Heidi said as she rushed up to my cage. Gail giggled. Oh, Og, my favorite frog, she said as she hurried to my friend's tank. And you're my favorite teacher, Richie told Mrs. Brisbane. Thank you, Richie, she replied, but you have to give Miss Becker a chance. She's an excellent teacher. I know, Richie said, but she doesn't have any classroom pets. Heidi leaned in close to my cage. I'm doing pretty well raising my hand this year, Humphrey, she told me. That was unsqueakably good news. Mrs. Brisbane and I had worked hard to help her end her bad habit. Boing, boing, Og twanged, sending Gail into peals of laughter. I don't think Gail could ever stop giggling completely. At least I hoped not. I was so glad to see my old friends from last year, I jumped on my wheel and started spinning fast, which made them all giggle. Go, Humphrey, Richie said. Then Og decided to dive into the water side of his tank and make an extra big splash, which made them giggle even louder. Awesome, Og, Heidi said. I think Og and Humphrey are glad to see you, Mrs. Becker said. Mrs. Brisbane said. Oh, Mrs. Brisbane, we miss them so much, Heidi said. We came to ask you something important. I slowed down the wheel. You say it, Richie, Gail said. Okay. Richie suddenly looked serious and he cleared his throat. Mrs. Brisbane, we don't think it's fair that you have 2 classroom pets in room 26 and we don't have any in room 18. We were hoping you would donate one of yours to Miss Becker. Thank goodness I'd hopped off my wheel so I wouldn't have fallen over. I was really surprised, and so was Mrs. Brisbane. Goodness, I don't think my students would like that, she said. If Miss Becker wants a classroom pet, she can get her own. But I'm not sure she wants one. And Og came here from She'd like Humphrey or Og, everybody does, Gail said. And Og came here from another classroom, Heidi said. At least ask her, please, Richie begged. Mrs. Brisbane was unusually quiet. I was too, and I didn't hear a bong or a splash from Og. Please? Gail looked so serious I could hardly believe it was her speaking. Please? Heidi added. At last Mrs. Brisbane spoke. To tell you the truth, I can't imagine giving up either one of them. Don't you think they'd miss each other? Heidi and Gail glanced at each other. They weren't always together. Humphrey was alone in the beginning, Richie said. I had to squeak up for myself. But it was so lonely at night, even scary. Aw, poor Humphrey. I hope you don't lose Og either. That would be very sad. He's your best friend. Boing, boing, Og agreed. Boing, boing, boing. That made Gail giggle, of course. Mrs. Brisbane smiled. I'll tell you what, I'll think about it, and I'll talk to Miss Becker about classroom pets. But I'm not sure it's such a good idea to separate Humphrey and Og and take one of them away from my class. Thanks, Mrs. Brisbane. We really miss them, Richie said. They chatted with the teacher for a few more minutes, and it was time for everyone to go home. After they left, Mrs. Brisbane leaned in close to my cage and stared at me. To tell the truth, I can't imagine teaching without you and Og to help me, she said. Am I just being selfish? No, I squeaked at the top of my tiny little lungs. Mrs. Brisbane chuckled. I don't think Arlene Becker wants any classroom pets. Not even you, she said, so don't worry. Thanks, I squeaked. I won't. But I did. I worried and worried and worried and worried some more. And even though he hatched from an egg and was cold-blooded, I could tell that Og was worried too. All right, here it is, boys and girls. I don't know if you can see it with the dark. We're at the end of the chapter, so you know what that means. Humphrey's Rules of School. It's actually possible to be too helpful. Ooh, I think they're talking about helpful Holly. So I wonder how that's going to work. It sounds like Mrs. Brisbane has a plan for that, boys and girls. All right, so that is chapter 10, and we will read next week chapter 11 and 12. 11 is called Brisbane's Buddies. All right, I didn't think it was kind of funny. I didn't notice, but Humphrey was riding the llama the whole time. Humphrey's got the right idea. All right, Lomtastic students, I'm out. Have a fantastic rest of your day or evening, and stay safe and do all your work. Check your Google Classroom and work on your programs. Remember to push turn in. Please push turn in. Some of you are not doing that. Thank you so much, boys and girls. I miss you all.